Hi, I'm It's Guest Gaming,
I'm KM Best.
And I'm Jules Robbins.
and we are here to launch the March season and a brand new mechanic, Objective. So to do that, Jules, why don't you introduce a little bit more than just who you are and let us know how you integrate into this entire season specifically.
I'm a principal game designer on Marvel Snap. I've been at Second Dinner for about 2 years. So I spend a lot of my time working on new cards, new season themes, new locations, and I was the lead designer for this season.
Let's go right into it and talk about Objective. Now, when Objective was being introduced as a new and original idea for Marvel Snap, what led to that idea that made the team say, I'm going to map this into the game in some way? And now here we are today. So walk us through that original idea journey.
So we actually sort of came at this from two separate angles. On the one hand, we were starting on this X-Men Origin of Apocalypse season, and it would be really cool if we had some sort of through line about what it meant to be a Horseman of the Apocalypse. At the same time, we'd been spending a lot of iteration cycles on previous seasons trying to work with this space of cards that were asking you to get to a very specific state or accomplish a specific goal. You've seen that in release on Spider-Man Noir and Phantom X. We were struggling with asks on that sort of space to make cards that could really shine, and kept running into issues working with our existing mechanics.
Now, the first thing that strikes me as really interesting about this mechanic is that these cards work at any time. You don't have to have the card see you complete the objective. If you complete the objective at any time over the course of the game and then draw and play the card, it will know that you have completed the objective. What was the design process behind making a card that plays in that way? Because that feels like a very unique functionality for a mechanic like this to have.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't our first instinct either. On some level, it's just more intuitive if the card is sitting in play, or at least on the screen in your hand, tracking when stuff happens. Marvel Snap is so short, 6 turns, and really hard to line things up so that you can have a satisfying objective to chase if you have this card early and it's not a complete blank when you draw it in one of the last few turns of the game. So we wanted to find a way to sort of bridge those gaps.
So then when designing the full mechanic of Objective, what was one of the goals that maybe you set very early on that would help make this feel naturally intuitive to any Marvel Snap player?
I think our biggest early learning, and that really shaped this, was sort of how fervently you want to pursue the objective. Initially, we thought there was some pretty interesting gameplay space in objectives that cared a lot about the game state at the time, caring about the leftmost card in your hand, so that you might want to carefully tune when you're firing it and have very different outcomes each time. But we found this was pretty unsatisfying for a lot of players who saw the new thing and just wanted to pursue it. We ended up with a philosophy where we really wanted to make sure if you just pursue the objective from the outset, at least for this initial batch, that's going to turn out well for you.
When you first pitched Objective internally, what was the feedback from the team, and what was the biggest problem that you saw that you felt you needed to overcome?
People were definitely excited about the promise of the mechanic right away. Having a quest to chase down, whether that's collecting 10 rat pelts in an RPG or something in Marvel Snap, it's just a beloved play pattern. Our early iterations had a lot of stumbling blocks for playtesters. Maybe most notably, we'd started thinking it would be most intuitive if the objective condition was met and fired the effect as soon as you had gotten there. But that ended up interrupting lots of other effects in ways that people were really surprised by in practice, especially when an objective condition was going to count unrevealed cards. And if you have Sabah Nur trying to swap stuff before you've even revealed the cards for the turn, it just didn't line up with what made sense to people, even though if you asked them exactly what it meant after they'd read it, they gave you the right answer.
That balance of intuition and actual function feels like the most interesting thing about this mechanic to me, because it operates in such a similar but different way to other Marvel Snap mechanics. When you were designing these cards, how did you look towards the way in which they functioned as a way to express something about the character, something about the feel, something about the idea of being, for example, granted the power of one of Apocalypse's horsemen?
Yeah, we were definitely looking for somewhat of a range here for how much the card is kind of looming over the game, promising an awesome thing that's going to give your opponent a state of fear up front, you know, sort of the looming dread, knowing they're rampaging across the countryside and your city's next, versus the sort of exciting moments that can turn around a game that I think are such a compelling part of what makes Marvel Snap replayable and why people are excited to Odin over and over again, because you don't know if it's coming on the last turn. So we were definitely trying to bridge so that we could have some cards filling each of those roles, and sometimes even a card transitioning in which one it filled.
So now you've pitched it to the team is looking at objective, and now you're testing it. How do you test this specifically to decide whether it's exciting or stressful?
This was definitely something we struggled with a lot in testing. You know, as we were starting out and trying to link the horsemen together, we thought maybe it would be cool if we could enable a deck where people might play all 4 horsemen in the same deck, and thought about trying to set up objectives so that, you know, accomplishing one, its output would help fulfill the conditions for another and form this sort of loop. And playtesters were tearing their hair out trying to track all of these different things going on in the game. We knew that that was beyond the pale, and where we sort of landed learning was the big differentiator there is feeling like you can tackle the task. So we wanted to make sure our first outing of objectives had a lot of conditions that once you built around a little bit, playing your game somewhat normally, you can clearly build some progress towards whether or not that's actually going to be enough to consistently accomplish the objective. You can see what you need to do to get there.
So what's the thing that you expect to learn the most from players playing this, as opposed to like a fairly limited testing team? What is the biggest piece of player feedback that you'll be looking at on the first few weeks of objective being out?
There are a lot of angles. There are a lot of moving pieces for this mechanic, but I think the things we're kind of waiting with bated breath on are trying to suss out more guidelines from what people actually enjoy in practice, what sorts of goals people have more or less fun trying to pursue, versus maybe we made the condition too easy and the output only feels kind of okay when you get there. Maybe most of all, what's fun to play against from the other side if you can see your opponent building towards this big finish. You know, what objective outputs will feel cool when they happen against you, and what do people end up dreading watch build up?
How do you feel that objectives in an ideal world will mesh into the snapping and retreating mechanics of Marvel Snap, and how do you feel that they are likely to mesh into those mechanics?
Yeah, a lot of the real case depends on, you know, fine grain dials of balance. How well did we get them? And a lot of it is based on the metagame. At baseline, a lot of these cards are going to end up in decks with other things to do on that same spot on the curve, and they're more efficient to just play out early and your opponent sees them coming. That has some gamesmanship to it on, you know, are you going to play this and your opponent knows you're gunning for it? Now they'll respect a bluff snap from you, even though you don't actually have a good position to accomplish the objective. Maybe if people are snapping a lot with them, you want to hold your objective card till later, try to conceal that you're getting here. Of course, there's the second level on if you're playing them out early, people start to play a lot of tech cards against them, try to Cosmic Ghost Rider, remove your text. And maybe if you can try to hold them till late, suddenly Negasonic Teenage Warhead and Goliath are instead the counters to them. So a lot of our hope is this will be dynamic and changing over time, and your decks with objective cards aren't going to just keep playing out the same way.
So now with the players interacting with objective, and now they're trying to build their decks with this brand new mechanic, how can specifically objective reward creativity and not punish it?
Yeah, it's definitely a fine line here. You know, we want to make objective conditions that are clear enough in what they're asking the player for to not just leave people lost with no idea how to pursue them. A lot of this was just iteration on the specifics, trying to make sure that there are obvious paths, but also lots of different branches off from there on ways to accomplish the objectives. I'm really excited to see what sort of creative approaches players on the outside find, and probably they will find decks around these cards that we hadn't even dreamed of.
So now the player base is going to have the card. They have Sabah Nur as the first ever objective card. Why Sabah Nur?
A lot of this is coming from sort of the flavor and lore surrounding the character. You know, we had this through line we were looking at for the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and Sabah Nur as Apocalypse creates them. They're his progeny and then his selected individuals as he goes through the generations. So really felt appropriate for him to be sort of the headliner or epitome of whatever we gave the horsemen. And we're in ancient Egypt, and Sabah Nur is first being granted the power of the Celestials to become Apocalypse is sort of the perfect beat to hit with this.
Did it ever occur to you in the process of creating a new Apocalypse card just how quest objective-y the previous Apocalypse card was? Is that sort of serendipity? Because I remember when I first started playing this game, that was my favorite card because of the way it functioned to herald itself. Were there any influences from the current Apocalypse that landed in this one?
Subconsciously, we were ultimately wary of trying to lean too heavily into discard and sort of both silo this character who's a huge part of Marvel lore into this one narrow band, and also make him compete with himself. We'd rather let more people who love Apocalypse play with Apocalypse versus saying you've got to love both Apocalypse and discard decks for this character to ever be for you.
When building Sabah Nur, you mentioned the grandeur, you mentioned his stature. All of that comes across in him being just a very big guy for his energy cost when you can accomplish him. But how did you land on the condition you landed on, which is to fill up the front rows of lanes? And how much of his power do you think is in the flip effect of him, or in just being a big guy for what you're paying?
So we landed on this condition mostly in trying to give the first objective card most players are going to see on the season pass, sort of the prototypical path we would like for our first outing, where the objective is easy to make progress towards, but the player has some agency over it, and there are clear ways they can pursue doing it better than a deck might by default. I think this accomplishes that pretty well in most games, and as for the output, what you're getting for it, this is where we saw opportunity to give a little bit more of a deck building hook to this card, where we wanted lots of decks to be able to experiment with it, but the output you get is going to vary a lot based on just how inky is the thing you get to swap away, how stacked is your deck with stuff that's great to swap out.
I mean, the fan favoritism absolutely is also present, because then you've also got Juggernaut, right? Juggernaut is an incredibly popular character in Marvel lore simultaneously. Obviously, Juggernaut has a much different objective. So with that being more focused towards board diversity, I think is the best way to word it. What does that say about the type of gameplay that you want to encourage with the different objectives?
Part of it is certainly that having all of these in the same season, we want a bunch of different types of gameplay. As far as broader top level goals, I think a lot of the opportunity we see in this mechanic is to make players care about things in ways that they haven't before, sort of recontextualize a lot of cards, give you reasons to use cards that might have fallen by the wayside or in combination with different cards that you never had reason to play them with before.
It's interesting because then you've got a card like Juggernaut, which is going to reward having multiple different powers hit the board. And when you're deck building, sure, you have your one variation of it where a deck wants to be incentivized to have all similar powers, like a Cerebro deck. And then you've got Juggernaut, which is playing into the other direction. So when you're building the objective mechanic, how can you make sure that the planning is going to be more rewarded versus getting that creative element punished? Because I know we've seen something similar in the past with costs when it happened with Ms. Marvel, for example. But this one playing into power, how does that play into releasing it to the public?
Yeah, this one I think is a perfect example, right? At your baseline, you might go, I'm going to build a Juggernaut deck. Let me just find all the best cards I can that have different power from each other and throw them in there. Maybe you can find enough different power cards that are all in the same archetype to build sort of a variation there. Or maybe all of this is completely the wrong approach and you're not even trying to have different powers in your deck. You're trying to have cards generate different powers and you want to play Rhino, who gives you a 5 power along with a 0 power card. We have our theories, but I don't know that we even know which is the best route to take with Juggernaut.
When you make a card like Juggernaut, Horseman of War, or Sabah Nur, who have cards in the game already, how much pressure do you feel alternately to make them meaningfully different? And how much pressure do you feel to make them kind of the same?
Yeah, I think a lot comes down to context on a few different fronts. Some of it is like, well, how is the original mechanical execution to what the character is really about versus just one expression of it? We don't want to be different just for the sake of being different if it's just going to make a card that doesn't resonate with the character anymore. Another question is like how big an overlap there is between people who love the mechanical space the first card played into versus people who love the character. The more people there are who love a character but don't want to play with their card, the more likely we are to want to go a different route with them.
So whether it be revisiting a character that already exists in the game or it become brand new cards, how much room does Objective specifically now give you in the world of designing future cards for Marvel Snap?
I think this mechanic opens up really a lot of space. There's both the sort of combinatorics on having this input-output pair means that even objective cards with a pretty similar condition or a pretty similar result to another objective card can end up playing out very differently because of the different contexts they're going to land themselves in. More so, it's kind of broadening what we get to care about easily in Marvel Snap. There are a lot of things that happen way too frequently over the course of the game for us to give you a meaningful reward every time you do them, but Objective can sort of conglomerate those into a bunch of triggers for one big output instead of needing a tiny one that scales. It can care about things that happen early in the game in a way that cards that already need to be in play can't care about, and use that for effects that need to happen at a particular time, versus before we could mostly only do that on an ongoing card or some very hard to track on reveal where you were trying to figure out what had happened before in the game. So we're pretty excited to unlock a lot of space for fun cards that we haven't been able to make with the existing mechanics.
Yeah, in that same space, I wonder from your perspective, now that you have access to a tool like Objective, how does it make you reassess cards that already do exist in the game that maybe might have something that could be turned into an objective style mechanic versus it be an activate or an on reveal, etc. right now? Has Second Dinner already started even thinking about that?
Yeah, we have started thinking about this. We don't want to, jump the gun before we see how people receive the mechanic. And there are, definite costs. Even when we're making a card stronger overall, we'd be, breaking up interactions that people already use. So, for instance, I think Phantom X has been a card on our mind that maybe could be an objective. We'd love to hear player feedback about whether or not you'd like him to be. And it's like that would make doing his thing easier on its own, but would also break players' ability to use him with Jocasta that a lot of people have done. And so we're always trying to weigh these trade-offs. But I think, the better objective is received and the better our hopes for the gameplay play out, the more likely we are to potentially revisit an existing card or two and reshape them into an objective.
A lot of these objective cards feel sort of restrained. Do you feel like there's a maximalist version of this that opens up whole new archetypes, a la the aforementioned like Phantom X objective kind of thing, that contrasts to these objective cards that seem a little bit more designed for you to be able to put the flavor onto them, as opposed to something that is very strict in telling you, I am your entire game plan?
Yeah, I think that space we're very likely to pursue in the future. We're mostly worried about having a lot of cards in that vein stacking up all in the same release, leaving a very narrow path to go down. But in addition to this sort of like choose your flavor thing, Objective does a very good job of saying, no matter when you draw this card, I'm going to pay you off for having gone down a strict game path. So I expect us to do that in the future.
Thank you so much to Jules Robbins for taking the time to explain to us a lot of the design principles behind Objective. I'm Cam Best. As always, I'm joined by It's Guest Gaming. And Jules, take us out. You got anything you want to say at the end?
Thanks so much for having me on. It's, from my mind, really a treat to get to talk through all the design minutiae. We spend so much time thinking it through and, often only get to see the output on the few most powerful places a card lands. Seriously, though, thanks so much for having me on. I love talking about this stuff.